Another really positive aspect of developing a tolerance for uncertainty is this concept that is about sort of, different writers have talked about this throughout time, with the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, we're here with Dr. Tess Bird, has a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Oxford, where she conducted anthropological research with households facing major life transitions in the northeastern United States. She later conducted a study on uncertainty and well-being with over 80 households in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. She's a former Mellon Fellow in Writing for the Social Sciences at Wesleyan University, where she taught courses on uncertainty, environmental change, and writing. Tess works as a scientific editor and is working on a book about finding well-being in uncertain times. And I feel like we all need that book, Tess. So happy to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. It's nice to be here.
Well, we all have these times in our lives where the degrees of change occurring are larger than we're used to, perhaps. Sometimes it's like the speed at which things change or the magnitude of the change. Like I went to the store to buy my favorite deodorant the other day and I couldn't get it. So now what? Is there some uncertainty there? Something like that is very small. Or maybe I put ingredients in a pot and I'm not sure how the soup is going to taste at the end. Like these are very small things compared to something that might feel like what we first think of when we think of uncertainty, which is some big life event, like a divorce or experience a big loss or making a big move or like living through a global pandemic maybe. But I'm guessing that there's a common element in all these experiences. And today, I hope we're going to talk about that common element. I'm so excited to get into this with you, Tess.
Yeah, I love where you started because what I actually looked at with my research is what I call everyday uncertainty. So it's that whole spectrum of what you just covered. It's, what we put in the soup or a change in the weather or what we're going to wear that day. We were just talking before we got on about summer vacation. What are we going to do during summer vacation? All these questions, everyday questions, but then also these big, big life transitions. And on the highest scale, uncertainties around climate change or, war or just extreme weather events, whatever those big, big uncertainties are that we might be collectively dealing with. And so I like to define uncertainty really simply to kind of encapsulate this, which is the condition or experience of not knowing. We can kind of probably break that down while we're talking, but it has a lot to do actually with this brain-body difference. So not knowing is really a cognitive experience. It's something that we're not sure of in our heads. So I think, with uncertainty, we are used to these headlines all the time of talking about how negative it is and how bad it is to be in the state of not knowing. But actually, as an anthropologist, I have a kind of unique perspective from that field, which differs from how it's defined in psychology and probably biology and different sciences, because it really focuses on uncertainty as a relational and social tool that we use. So humans will really, I almost want to say it's like innate to like who humans are in some ways, but we will really draw on it to think about our futures, to sort of negotiate social relations, to connect with people that we love in different ways. So there can be very positive ways, like love itself can be an uncertain experience, right? And then negative aspects of that, such as breakups or death or, these things. So I think it's a different take and it's much more balanced. And I kind of want to advocate for this more, balanced approach to uncertainty, because I think when we put it there, we can have a much more productive and creative conversation about how it can help us.
Yeah, totally. I think that's really helpful. And also it does seem that I feel like whenever you talk about uncertainty, you have to talk about anxiety and all of the other sort of responses that people get to uncertainty. And one thing that always surprises me about humans is that somebody could go through something that I would think would be like really benign and then have like the hardest time with it. And on the
Yes.
other hand, somebody could go through something that I would think of, oh my God, that's like the worst thing that could ever happen. I can't even imagine going through that. And then they're fine. So it does seem that the way that uncertainty affects us is just very personal as well.
It's completely personal and contextual. I think people can have a higher tolerance for uncertainty in a home that creates more positive structures for them than in a home that doesn't, as one example. I should say, in psychology, there's a whole field that's been studied since the 1950s around tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. And so that is a really big, it tries to differentiate personality characteristics, such as openness to experience, that would make us more willing to engage with uncertainty.
Okay. Yeah. And like in Ayurveda, the way we would probably say like different constitutional types have greater tolerance for it, literally from like a physics perspective, which, maybe we could talk about later. But I'm super fascinated because it's an intriguing topic and it sounds like it could also be like a little bit of a scary topic, but one that we all want to kind of develop some strength around. And I'm kind of curious, how did you get into even studying this particular topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should start way back as I grew up with an artist, and I think I probably had a quite high interest in the creative aspects of uncertainty as part of that creative process. But I was in my PhD program, and I was actually looking at initially the material culture of obesity in households. That was sort of my goal of my research project. And I got into these households. And to backtrack, as an anthropologist, you do field work most of the time. So I spent a year researching household with participant observation. So kind of doing interviews and all these traditional qualitative methods, but also just living with different households, visiting regularly, shadowing errands, hanging out with their kids. Like
they like let you come in their house and like
yeah, different scales of, commitment to it. But I had 18 households in Providence, Rhode Island. And
go roadie.
Yeah.
I grew up there.
It's a good state to grow up in, I think. Yes, I was in these households and pretty immediately I was like, no one cares about obesity and diet. Like all that's going on is anxiety and transition. So every single household was going through some type of life transition, like, recent divorce and then moving into a new house or moving into a new job and moving to the city for the first time or having a baby, sort of working through what that looks like to add a new member of the family, going through ailing parent and then experiencing death. So all these kinds of things. And I was just shocked at how all of them had something going on, like these big things and then all the micro stuff at the same time. So I was kind of tracking it and I started to ask, okay, how do people sustain well-being during these uncertain times and then negotiate that uncertainty with their households and in themselves? So that's where I got into that. And then
well, with that, did you have, no, because I find that interesting. Like, were you able to compare the houses? Because you have a certain sample of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're focusing on the obese population. And I was curious, did you have any other group to compare them to really think, were they experiencing more of this uncertainty or?
Yeah, let me backtrack again, because actually, the method I used was a snowball method. So I was actually looking at finding houses I already knew, asking them to introduce me to other houses, and then again to a third layer of houses. And so this was a decision around safety, being a lone female researcher without a lot of funding to have a research team, that there needed to be some
yeah, you're going into strangers' houses and you're kind of pretty,
Yeah. So very quickly it became clear, like, obesity is not this issue. Like, this is just not what I'm here to do. Like, I didn't go to a place where this is going to be an issue. Like it just, so that got shed really quickly. And then I still kept on this idea of like diet for a while, but that also shed right away. So I don't have anthropology, to go back to your question, is unique because its method is considered inductive, an inductive method as opposed to deductive. So most of science is deductive, where you have this like hypothesis and then you're going through, a test to get to a specific conclusion. And inductive is the opposite, where you are sort of gathering specifics. So you start with there to come up with a broader idea. And that means that your data is emerging from what matters to your participants. So you're actually going in with this like very uncertain, open mind to what is going to happen for them. So it's not really comparative in that way.
Yeah, it's definitely different. Thank you so much for explaining that, because my brain is going toward like, you need your control and your variable and blah, 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 blah. And this is quite refreshing, actually. And I think I'd probably be more comfortable with a method like this myself. So, okay. And I'm sure every method has its time and its place of why it's important to use these methods, right?
100%.
Yeah.
I say this raises questions, whereas, science is looking to answer those questions. But this brings up, a lot of research questions come from this kind of inductive method.
Right. Because it's almost like it's a little more exploratory in nature.
Yeah.
Right.
And my study is considered exploratory.
Okay. Okay. Got it. So what did you find? I mean, you found that these people were experiencing high levels of uncertainty and there was a lot of change transition going on. What does that tell us about uncertainty? Like, where did you go from there to learn how do people deal with this well? I mean, because at the end of the day, isn't that we all want to know? We want to know, like, life is going to be uncertain. What can we do about it? What do people do well? And what do people struggle with in these situations?
Yeah. So I have just a question first. I have, a second study and where I've come to answer that now, but I can answer also just at that time what I knew. What do you
Sure.
think?
Yeah. Tell the story. How'd you get there?
So at that time, one of the methods I used was a material culture approach. So I was asking people about their daily routines and kind of shadowing them with actually video and photography through like what their daily routines were in different interviews at different points. And this method is designed to get people out of their heads because mostly when you're in an interview, people will respond sort of based on what their brain wants to say at any given moment, right? But if you start asking them about objects or experiences in a kind of different way, it just opens up a new way of relating.
Like something that asks them to establish some meaning.
Yeah, and they start thinking about symbolic things where they might connect, different. For instance, what I asked in one case was, what are three, and I think this is a great question for people to ask themselves, is what are three experiences or things that are helping with your well-being and in the way of your well-being? And you go around your house and you just identify what those things are. And so I did this with people so I could really
Wait,
see.
that's a great question. Say it again.
So what are three things that are, I would say, experiences or things, so it could be people or objects in that way too, that are helping your well-being or in the way of your well-being? So three for each.
Okay.
Yeah.
Journal on that, friends. Journal on that.
It's so helpful. And so doing that, I really learned a lot about how people negotiate uncertainty, because I found on the one hand that well-being and uncertainty are so closely connected, because when uncertainty is an anxious thing for us, we do want to go towards a more equal state, equilibrium. Like we want to go back to well-being. That's what I noticed people doing. Like that was their goal during these times. So identifying those things really helped me see that people were, negotiating uncertainty with the people in their household, with their materials in their household, and they're finding these really creative ways to come to terms with it. And that's when I started to really pick up on what now has become kind of my first key element of negotiating uncertainty, which is present moment embodied practice. And so this idea is that essentially one of the first things we do when we hit uncertainty, a big uncertain event, and this was when I did a study during COVID, this really came up, was that we tend to do an activity that's going to keep us kind of grounded, keep us out of our brains, keep us in the present moment. So we're not going down the spiral of anxiety in the future or, ruminating about the past. And these practices, when they're embodied and getting us out of our head in some way, are really, really helpful. And so people articulated that in various ways in the first study. For instance, around how a lot of people meditated and did yoga in this community. So how those things really helped them in the long term. When they went through an uncertain period, they sort of hunkered down on those activities. Cooking is another big one. Gardening, creative projects, just different things that we do to really be in the present.
Like self-care practices, manage the chaos. I mean, clearly that's the name of the game. If that's probably what I spend my entire day doing with people. Because I guess if life wasn't challenging in some way, like, would you really need to do some of these things? I don't know. We could debate that. But maybe it's because doing these things makes life easier.
Yes.
One of the things I heard you say that I didn't hear you say this, but I sort of pulled it out of what you said. And I want to just see if I'm on the right track here. I heard you say that like people are using various things, materials or tools, whatever that they have. And is it that people they're doing what they have access to. They're using things. It's not like they're letting themselves go, right? They're using the things that they have access to. Like people are doing the best job that they can with the tools that they have.
Yeah, and in anthropology, we'd call that cultural resources as well as social and cultural resources. So it's essentially drawing on not just your physical tools, like someone picked out a meditation bench, right? But you're also drawing on, cultural resource might be how your families pass down different ways of dealing with uncertainty.
Right.
What you learned from your mother or
yeah,
that kind of
or
thing.
Even like things from your religion, would that sort of fall into that?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, religion really came up a lot as far as drawing on as a resource when things were hard.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I mean, that's what I was wondering, because some of it has to do with this idea of routine. And to me, like the word religion is not exactly synonymous with routine, but like you can be a spiritual person and have this connection with God, or you could be like this, or whatever your God is, or whatever you connect with that's higher than you. And then you can have like routines that you carry out, quote unquote, religiously on a regular basis to stabilize your life, whether that's going to a Giants game or a Red Sox game once a week or going to church, like these routines. One of the other things that you said was the spiral of anxiety. This is a term that I'd love for you to define a little bit more, a spiral of anxiety. Because I definitely think of anxiety a lot when I think of uncertainty. I think a lot of people get it and then have other reactions that stem from that.
Yeah.
What is the spiral? Yeah.
So I would say that's definitely not a scientific term. And I want to clarify too that with my research, when I use anxiety, I tend to define it locally as how my participants define it, not medically. So it's not like a diagnosed anxiety disorder that they would have, but a lot of people, in our everyday language talk about general anxiety. And so it's a common concept. So that's when I talk about it, I'm really trying to say it's that spiral of our brains essentially getting stuck in our own narrative. Like you just keep going with whatever you think is going to happen, and you're kind of stuck in this very mental state. And that can become very embodied, right? If you're not conscious of it. So there's that anxiety cycle there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's sort of,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like whirling thoughts, active mind. And like what you were saying earlier is what are the things that we do to turn that off or to just kind of get back in our bodies so that we don't kind of obsess or like pay so much attention to those little thoughts that are happening all the time that are driving us crazy.
Yep. Well, I can tell you my own spiral of anxiety because I started to develop a kind of a name for this.
Ooh.
That I see in other people too, which is fix-it mentality. And it's, when something is out of our control, we start to get into this mindset of like, I can fix it. Like, I'm going to be able to do something about this. I can do self-work. I can eat better. I can exercise more. I can do all these things to start to control whatever's going on for me. And part of my own process of working with what I've learned, studying uncertainty, is reminding myself, okay, step out of that because that's in your head and you really don't have control right now if it's an uncertain thing. You don't have control. So how can you stay with this feeling of uncertainty in order to actually get more data, like back to the anthropological process? You're like staying with that uncertainty in order to really see all the elements at play, which are going to be sensory and embodied and part of our environment and our context and people around us, much more than they're just coming from up here.
Yeah. Like, and not springing into action so quickly, just kind of like paying attention a little bit more, doing a little bit of a deeper listening, if you will, to the situation. That's super cool. So you mentioned to me offline that there are actually like positive and negative examples of uncertainty. And for anybody who struggles with uncertainty, they're probably like, yeah, whatever. But I don't know, surprises, is that an example of a positive?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me more. Tell me more about this.
So one of the cool things I learned early on about uncertainty is that humans really like bounded experiences of uncertainty. For instance, we love to play games where we don't know the outcome, and we love mysteries in TV shows or books. And we also really enjoy conversations with friends where it's, going down these unknown paths. And we really enjoy the experiences of meeting a new person and falling in love and not really knowing where that's going when it feels positive, right? Like when you feel like it is going somewhere. And so those are things that have this kind of bounded positivity around it. And so I think they can be really positive for us. And I don't know anyone who, when I articulate that, is like, oh, I want to give that up. Like, if we could get rid of all uncertainty, I'm willing to give this stuff too, right? Like, life would be super boring. And for me, having an arts background, that's also a key part of it. Another really positive aspect of developing a tolerance for uncertainty is this concept that is about sort of, different writers have talked about this throughout time, with the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time so that you can really understand something. And so certain people are really good at this: entrepreneurs, scientists, anthropologists, artists, writers, like people who are really able to sit in that realms of gray.
Like, instead of thinking that the world is very black and white, like it's either evil or good, or like people just want this like one answer to everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for anyone who's been in like, a good therapy session, I think that's a lot of what therapists are doing too, is like getting people to see various sides of something. Like you're really trying to like develop this ability to sit in these realms of the unknown and be comfortable there. And then, the negative side really is, I hesitate to say that there's any uncertainty that's wholly negative, because what the research in anthropology really shows in everyday life is that uncertainty, even when it's the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, or a big disruption in some way in your personal life, there's both positive and negatives that come out of that. So you may lose things, but you're also going to gain things from that experience. So I think it's really just, it's more about learning to curb that anxiety and learning to be comfortable with discomfort.
Yeah. And my mind was going to this, place of, okay, when you fear something, usually, from uncertainty, your mind has sort of imagined or cooked up some outcome that you don't want to have happen.
Yes.
Right? But then you don't even know if that outcome is going to be the one. And maybe it is, but then you also have to decide, like, is it worth it? Because I'm going to get these other things. But in the reality, you don't even know all of those things. And you have to be like, there's a bit of surrender with this.
Yes. Total surrender. And, one technique I sometimes tell people around what you're talking about is, if you're going down that spiral of there's going to be this terrible outcome, is to try to stop yourself and say, okay, let me come up with 3 alternative narratives that end well, like end in a way that's going to be beyond my wildest dreams. So even if these things don't come true, it helps your brain begin to process different outcomes.
I really like that. So you're saying that we should write down 3 alternative outcomes that are different than the one that our brain is cooking up.
Mm-hmm.
I like that exercise. That sounds fun.
It is fun. It's a challenge sometimes, especially where you're in that moment, right? Like I definitely have that uncertainty anxiety where I'll just panic.
But maybe this is why, creative people, I don't know, have maybe a little bit more of a favorable relationship with this kind of stuff, because if you can imagine other outcomes, and if you can have the flexibility to allow yourself to jump off the track that you're on and say, okay, this doesn't necessarily have to be the way. Let's play with this, which is, I think, what we do with art. And one of the things is like, because, there's definitely probably a lot of spiritual and sort of people interested in wellness that listen to this podcast. And there's a lot of spiritual mind-body practices that are aimed at forming like a beginner's mind, something like Zen Buddhism, which is like intentionally trying to not know the answer, intentionally trying to not conclude, intentionally trying to just be here with my direct perception of what is happening right now. So then there's this question of like, does everybody need more of that, or do certain people need more of that?
I think that's a good question. I mean, one thing, I think there's so many overlaps when I was talking about present moment embodied practices, the overlaps with mindfulness practices, various types, is so big, right? Like it just really resonates there. And I like to say to people, like, don't be caught in a rigid practice. if it doesn't work for you. Like, you need to find the practice that brings you that joy, brings you into the present, that really works. And so for some people that really may be like, hiking, like, or something more extreme, or like just running really fast, or like whatever it is that's really going to help them. And so I think that probably everyone does need this on some level, right? Like, I think this helps us slow down and connect with others. Like, I think that's why it really matters, is it's giving us a kind of fuel to then connect. And I think we need it more when we're going through uncertain times. We need to remember to do that practice. I've tried to do that in my own life. Like, one of the things I've done is like sort of taught what I've learned to other people and done it with myself. And so if I'm going through an uncertain phase, if I hunker down on those practices, it pushes me further quicker. But I also think we forget when we're not in an uncertain place to do that stuff. Like, we don't always give ourselves the time that we need. And then we can feel the stress and anxiety build up.
Yeah. It's like I was listening to some guy talk about the ellipses in a sentence. And you're a writer, so you probably appreciate this. But like, when you write something and you have a period, okay, boom, conclusion. But when you write the 3 dots, you don't know where that's going. And it's like, it leaves this like open space of what is next. And it's funny because I used to write all of my emails when I was like in my 20s. I never ended anything with a period. Everything was like ellipses. And I would go back, like, I don't know why, even at work, I don't know why I did this, but I've always enjoyed the unknown. And I guess, well, obviously not in all things in my life. I try to control things like the best of them. But, I mean, it's enlivening to have uncertainty, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I love it when I love it, right? And then when it's hard,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we go a little deeper with it, if you're faced with something pretty serious in your life, right? Like, you get a terminal diagnosis for an illness, I mean, obviously we all know we're going to die. So there's not even like uncertainty about that, because we're all going to die someday. And that is like some people's greatest fear, is that they're all going to die. But it's that we don't know when we're going to die, and we don't know how we're going to die. And we don't know, are we going to have pain? There's a bunch of questions that come up about that. So even though like the outcome of your life in this lifetime,
right,
there is tons of uncertainty between here and there.
Yep. And death is a hard one, I think, because you can go down so many spirals with it, especially if you are suddenly confronted with a diagnosis or someone dying, right? I think that's something that grief for me in my life has been that's been one of my big, big uncertainties afterwards. And I think actually tangentially, this is part of what happens when we go through a big life experience, a life transition, is that we essentially for a while enter like what anthropologists call liminal space, which is this space of being betwixt and between. So our identity of who we were kind of shuts away. And we're in that time for like an unknown amount of time, right? Like, you don't know how long it's going to take before you sort of have a grasp of your identity on the other side again. And death is like, grief is really big for that, for a lot of people. If you lost someone very close to you, you just don't know how you'll rework your life without that person, right? And so I think that the identity shift is a really key aspect of something that can be, I think, endlessly hard in some ways, like just figuring out who that is. But I really, why I go back again and again to these like everyday practices, and when I was talking about the narrative thing, like come up with 3 different stories, is that, if we think about how our identity shifts after a big change, we can come up with one story, like, and we often will. As soon as something changes, we have a story in our minds because we are story-driven people. But how that actually unfolds,
like the story about what happened or the story about what will happen?
Both.
Okay.
It's essentially the story you're telling yourself, I mean, let's stick with the grief example. When someone dies, I think you're telling a story about their lives, your life with them, and you have a story in your head of what your life is going to look like now. And in the darkness of that, it can be really bleak. Like, that life that comes next can look really, hard. In the reality, looking back, 5 or 10 years later, you find ways to integrate that into a new experience of living. So you kind of form this new identity. But it doesn't happen because you say to yourself, I'm going to be okay, or I'm going to get over this. It happens through this daily routine, this everyday practice of becoming a new person and living with others, right? Learning from others and connecting to others.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's been a really long time since someone very, very close to me has passed away. Like, it's been decades, actually. I haven't had like a big loss. I've had a divorce, I've had other kinds of losses, but from what I remember going through these kinds of experiences, like, yeah, there's a lot of new identity forming. It's amazing how much our identities do form by the people that, the relationships that we have with other people. And like you said, because it's all about the interactions, it's all about the routines, and like our lives in some ways are just like this collection of, I eat my breakfast, I go for a walk,
Right.
I watch a movie,
Yeah.
I have sex, I get my period,
Right.
I go to sleep, I wake up, I laugh, I smile, I eat some fruit. Like, I mean, it's just, this is life, right? But then the world inside of our heads is so much more embellished, the thoughts that we can have as humans. This is really fun to talk about. So I have a little boy right now. And what do you think would be like some of the top things, like as he's forming, right? His ego and everything. What do you think would be some of the most important things to teach or to model? Or I'm not really sure if it's teaching or modeling, if you just get this stuff through life experience, but for a child to make them more comfortable with uncertainty, what would you recommend?
That is a great question. And I will say I haven't thought that much about this question, and I really should. But I think right away, the first thing that comes to mind is something that I think we can learn at any age that's important to model, but it's the ability to, when I said before, this idea that we enjoy uncertainties that have a bounds, I have this idea of creating micro certainties, which are sort of security toolkit. And so this is a technique I used with my students, undergrad students, but I think it's really good for younger children, which is essentially to think through when things go wrong, when you're feeling really uncertain or there's this kind of anxiety or you don't know something. I think with little kids, what it must be, a lot about friendships or not getting what you want, or, like sometimes you're going through a big life event as a child, but often it's these smaller.
I didn't get my ice cream after dinner.
Yeah, right. Or like even thinking about the future, like what's it going to be like to go to the next grade level or those kinds of things. It's coming up with what are our security blankets, our security, but not necessarily a literal object, but what do we use to feel good? So making a list of those things and remembering them, or teaching a child when they feel uncertain or they're in that state to go back to those security things, spend some time with them, and then come back to the bigger questions. So it's sort of like going back and forth. And I like to say, for adults, this is so like, if you're going through an uncertain thing or you're in an uncertain environment, I'm always like, bring your security blanket, which for me is a cup of tea, which I always have. And it's just something that you can kind of like have that's really certain. It's not going away and it's all yours. And so no matter what happens, it's there.
One argument for smoking cigarettes, by the way. No, just kidding.
So this is great for this transition because it is true. Like what I saw in my research, like a lot of people rely on alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, various things to help them get through uncertain times, like huge. And so it can be fine. Like sometimes this is like, I don't want to, morally say anything about it. But what helps us get better at negotiating uncertainty is finding micro certainties that are elastic. So there's things that can expand as we expand. And so something like a friendship that's really secure is a great example because you're able to play with uncertainty in it, but you always know that person's going to be there. And so I think with a child, that's such a good thing to play with, is like being that secure person, but also allowing for some freedom in how that negotiation process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And like, it's amazing how many schools are doing yoga and mindfulness with kids now. And, I haven't had a lot of success with my 6-year-old so far trying to get him to like meditate, which is really funny because when you give a kid a timeout, when they're having, an outburst of some sort or emotional challenge, they really view it as a punishment, to be put in a timeout. But any of us who are adults who put ourselves in timeout know that it's like amazing. It's amazing to just like meditate or like lay down on a bolster for 15 minutes or something. And one of the things, but it's different when you're a child and somebody's telling you, go check out, you know? And so that's one of the things I'm going to take as a takeaway from this is like this idea of believing you have agency in how you choose to regulate yourself, as opposed to like me forcing the kid to go like have a timeout.
I think that's great. And immediately as you're talking, I was thinking, what would it be like if instead of timeout, it's like, okay, you need to go do something that brings you joy right now. You know, like,
yeah. He'd be like, shut up, mommy. Stop talking to me.
Yeah, I know.
That's great. So I think you've given some really good tools for people today, but are there any other tools that you think are really important that are kind of quick and easy for people to manage uncertainty?
Well, I gave you my best ones already, but I'll reiterate, it's that present moment practice is so important, that identifying micro certainties, narrative shifts, like being able to change your narratives. Another one I really like is, I call it this triangle map. I think this is really good with couples, actually, to kind of figure out your security systems, like what your uncertainty systems look like in a household. And what you do is you draw a triangle on a piece of paper, and at the top you put the self, and then in another corner you put essentially social life, and in another corner you put material life, material culture. Then you ask yourselves those questions about well-being. So you say, okay, things that are good for my well-being, where do they go on this triangle? And then which category do they go in? And then things that are bad or feel like they're in the way of your well-being, where are they? And I would use 2 different colors for both of those questions. And you can start to move things. Sometimes it's nice to have, index cards or something so you can actually move them around, or Post-it notes, because you might put something down on, like, you might put down yoga on the self category and then discover that actually yoga helps you be a better partner. So it actually belongs also in the social category. That came up a lot in my research of people identifying, self-helpful things as actually being for their families.
Which is interesting because it's something that you do by yourself, but then, it makes your relationships better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wrote a paper on that. So this tool, if you do it as a couple, I think it's great to each do a separate triangle, not share it until the end. So you can come back. And sometimes if you're having some conflict, domestic conflict or, life conflict, it can be really helpful to see what really matters to your partner and where it's not getting time. So just drawing this out helps you see where your gaps are, because essentially it's a triangle because this is a strong, strong structure that essentially, when you have a triangle table, it kind of can be put on any surface. It doesn't matter how bumpy it is. And I developed that idea during my research, during fieldwork. I also interviewed homeless individuals who were part of a group in Providence I was working with. And I was shocked. They told me all their stories of how they became homeless. And every story, at least 2 of those legs fell away. So either, their house burnt down, they lost all their material life and they suffered from mental illness, or their house burned down and they had no social connections. So we need, at least 2 of those to keep us stable. So if something's really radically upsetting yourself, maybe you're going through depression or some kind of shift, you need to really stabilize the other 2 to feel secure. Or if you're going through a divorce in that social one, you really need to hunker down on, the things that can stabilize it, including other social relationships, to keep that leg really stable.
I think it's brilliant. Yeah.
It's such a good activity.
And now I know the key to not becoming homeless.
Well, I don't know.
No, but it does seem super helpful for relationships. And then also to have dialogue about like how people might feel differently.
Yeah.
About those things. Like,
and, I really want to say, as we're talking, I'm just like, this one thing I always like to sort of add when I talk about my research is I studied mostly middle-class households. And one of the reasons for that was because it's an understudied group in a weird way. we tend to look at like, we don't study this kind of middle class world, but
because it's shrinking in the United States and like nobody's middle.
But one of the key things it shows is how if people are relatively materially secure, it is shrinking, right? We have this problem where it's not necessarily all material secure anymore. But if there is some relative material security, what can we do? So it shows the potential of creativity, stress, ability to handle stress, ability to handle healthcare, all these things. Like we can't expect any more than what can happen in the middle class. And things can barely happen, right? Like it's still really hard. So I think one of the things I advocate for doing this research is that we have to, as a society, at least give people those structures. Like we have to be able to have this really basic triangle structure to keep people healthy. And that's not always happening.
Yeah, because not everybody's a cowboy. Not everybody's yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, final question of the day, Tess. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
Well, I grew up hearing that phrase quite a lot from my mother and my father too. So it really, to me, means being able to listen, to shut down what I call your mental hijackers, and being able to tune in to what the body has to tell you. And part of what I think of is how the body, we're so sensory. We didn't really get into this, but definitely a part of uncertainties. Even when we go into fight or flight, the hormones pulsing through us are meant to like make us focus and connect to these things that we aren't taking in on a conscious level, right? Like they're super sensory experience. And the rest of the time we're completely sensory beings, like connecting through the five senses or through the way we move in space. Even I've been learning a little bit about how taste receptors are in our upper respiratory system. So there's so many ways that we engage with the environment. And I think it's so much information that we don't always pay attention to. It's definitely, for me, the foundation of managing uncertainty.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. Tell the audience how they can learn more about your super interesting work.
Yeah, so I have a website, which is just tessbird.com. That's bird, B-I-R-D, like the flying animal. And yeah, you can learn more about it there and reach out to me. I love talking to people about this. And hopefully my book will come out and then you can read that. And I do have a forthcoming article as well. So everything will be on my website. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tess.
Thank you.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. I get so excited. I get this kind of goosebump feeling when I get a booking from a new client that I haven't met yet. And I get so excited because I know that somebody has made a decision to go really, really, really deep into their healing. And because I know that Ayurveda is not a quote unquote normal thing that many people have access to, at least not in the United States where I live. So I know that when someone books with me, that they've really made a decision that they want to go deep into their healing. And so you could do that on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. You can book me for either a Ayurvedic consultation if you're ready to dive in, or you can also book me for a 15-minute connection call if you're not sure where to go yet. I do have a couple offerings that are not on my website, and we could talk about that. So I look forward to meeting you. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.